We've talked about T Mobile becoming the number one provider before with wide margins and with their acquiring of Sprint and how quickly they've implemented 5G, whether it's true 5G or not, that's to say. But nonetheless, kind of became the number one cell carrier with Verizon, the only close following one. And then you kind of had AT&T in the back. And pretty much everyone else that you think of, your Metro, your I don't know, you name it. Any other of those like smaller providers probably use AT&T or Verizon or T-Mobile's networks. That said, T-Mobile announced a massive deal to work with SpaceX and Starlink to also use Starlink's newer satellites to give connection to T-Mobile users anywhere by using satellites instead of cell towers to basically fill in the gaps of T-Mobile's cell coverage. AT&T, however, is not a fan and is trying to block this, but not quite for the reason you would think. Not because they couldn't go sign a deal with Starlink and do this as well, not because it's anti-competition for T-Mobile to be just plowing over the competition with all these deals, but more because AT&T and a rural telco say Starlink field phone services would cause interference. Basically, what AT&T is trying to say here is that if this deal goes through, that spectrum that they're going to use that the FAA opened up for SpaceX and T-Mobile to use together would interfere with AT&T's connections in these rural areas, which is exactly what this exact signing with Starlink and T-Mobile would fix for T-Mobile. But what's happening here, AT&T urged the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, to reject SpaceX and T-Mobile's proposal. The FCC's rules do not permit SpaceX proposed use of T-Mobile's terrestrial spectrum, and applicants failed to even request, much less justify, rule waivers that be necessary to authorize their proposed coverage from space, basically. So again, saying, hey, this is going to cause a problem, and this shouldn't be allowed. Their own rules shouldn't allow this. But AT&T has said its interest in the proceeding is because it has a license to use the adjacent spectrum in the PCSC block. So if you have your spectrums of connections, FCC gave SpaceX and Starlink and T-Mobile access to this one to use for their connection. AT&T wants to use the one right next to it, and they're basically saying they're too close. We're going to have communications that are going to get jumbled. They're connections that are going to interfere with each other and cancel out, cause problems. So SpaceX and T-Mobile's technical showings are willful and insufficient regarding the risk of harmful interference proposed by their planned SCS deployments, AT&T told the FCC. This just happened, so we don't really have much data beyond this other than this is a pretty, actually fair way for AT&T to go after this out of all the ways they could. But what does this really affect for T-Mobile and Starlink? This is actually a giant deal because about 7,500 satellites could be affected by this. So the FCC last month sought to comment on the application, noting that SpaceX requested modification of its license for low orbit Earth satellites to add direct-to-cellular communications capable of up to 7,500 Gen 2 Starlink satellites. These are ones they're launching this summer. These are satellites that are going to possibly going up now. This is very similar technology to the company that Apple is working with to provide their emergency services, where you can call from pretty much anywhere on an iPhone and get connection to a police station, a fire station, whatever you might need. So this is very similar that way, other than this will just be used all the time. You'll always have access to this. So the link to consumer devices would rely on 1910 to 1915 megahertz Earth to space and 1990 to 1995 megahertz space to Earth bands, known as the PCSG block, the FCC said. Now, the FCC is on board with satellite companies and mobile carriers partnering to close gaps on wireless networks. This is a pretty big deal in places where you don't have any internet access or cell coverage, where you might still only have satellite connections. Starlink has a much stronger, much more powerful connection in those areas, and this is one of the ways that you could get that out to people that don't have internet, which you could argue is extremely important to get everybody with internet. In a lot of people's lives, me included as a photographer, the internet is more of a utility for me at this point than just a like thing I use for fun. Like I need it for work. I couldn't do my job without it. So I do actually need it. And there's other people that need it as well, and this aims to bring it to them. So the FCC proposed a new regulatory framework to help satellite operators and wireless companies leveraging the growth in space-based services to connect smartphone users in remote, underserved, and unserved areas. But the FCC could still reject or require changes to their plan that T Mobile and SpaceX has. I doubt it, since they've already kind of let it go, and AT&T is kind of just late to the game here. So SpaceX said recently it plans to start testing the satellite to cell phone system with T-Mobile later this year, which as a T-Mobile user, I'm actually excited for, because this service, even in congested areas like a city, could possibly free up more bandwidth and give you a better connection in congested times in those areas. So it actually could be beneficial, not even just for rural people, but for people that live in a city. And with that, a rural wireless group has similar objections that it's going to cause issues with theirs. To an extent, I think this happens all the time, where you have people complaining about bands that are going to be going back and forth. Now, yesterday, the FCC sided with SpaceX in a separate battle over the spectrum use. As reported, the FCC rejected a Dish Network proposal that for mobile service in the 12.2 to 12.7 gigahertz band, saying Dish plan could be harmful for interference to satellite broadband services. So it is possible that the FCC could rule with AT&T. It depends on how established AT&T's service, I would say, is compared to what SpaceX is about to accomplish with launching all these satellites. Also, there's some trickery here with 7,500 satellites going up. How much does that benefit the government? Is that going to sway them? A lot of questions here. But AT&T says no, you are not allowed to use your satellites to phone services just yet. I want something to say about that. And we're going to see what ends up happening with that. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the podcast. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.